Immutable Linux distributions are taking over the Linux world. Is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? Should we adopt them or should we stay away from them? Today I want to talk a little bit about the Immutable Linux distributions and talk a little bit about my general thoughts about the widespread adoption and release of these distributions. Thanks for checking out this video by Switch to Linux, where we talk about why you should switch to Linux, some other Linux topics, and other things around free and open source software. If you like this type of content, please check to make sure you are still subscribed, or subscribed if you know you're not already. Leave us a like and a comment down below. So the first thing we want to do is we want to talk about what is an immutable Linux distribution. And so I found a couple of good articles, and we're going to look at this one here from dev.to. This is from Ed Rutherford from February. Immutable, a growing trend. What is it, how it works, and why you should seriously consider checking it out. So what I liked about this one is he kind of gets into how a basic Linux distribution starts. If you're running basic Arch or Debian or Linux Mint or Ubuntu or something like that, you have this basic model here. And so what he is looking at is you have your root, and then inside of here you have, and if you've gone into your file manager, you might have seen all of these different folders, and under your USR folder, you have these ones. Under your var folder, you have these ones. And so this is the way a standard operating system works. And when you push an update, it's going to make changes to individual files throughout here. And what happens is your system is going to change. It's going to patch files. It's going to put in new versions. And this is where we have a potential for some things going wrong and breaking. So what the immutable system does is, instead of patching all those individual files, is it will create a new image version itself. Now this lends itself more to a distribution that doesn't rapidly change as much. So Arch, of course, it's a little bit harder to do one of these because you're constantly re-imaging things. At what point in time do you release a new image or not? And it kind of breaks the entire rolling model of Arch. But something like Fedora or Ubuntu or even Debian, curiously there's not a lot of Debian based immutable distributions, there's a few, but you find in these areas, they are a little bit better for these. So in this instance here, we have version 1 of the operating system, and then each of the files are downstream, and then 2, 3, 4, and then however many your system keeps on hand. Usually at least 2, it could be a few more. But this raises one of the concerns that some people have. So I want to look at these pros and cons, and I'm going to dig into what I think is the most important down the road here. So some basic pros is you have a really good version control mechanism, that you have a solid single image. You can go back to that solid single image. There's not a lot of shifting things. It's not like, anybody's, if you were to take somebody running Arch, everybody has a slightly different Arch depending on when they've actually pushed those updates, on top of all of the different software you have installed. You simplify the maintenance by having the updates. In many instances like Fedora, it will update the containers completely in the background. Now, this is a problem if you are on a metered internet connection, but nevertheless, it is still a very good method there. And then the last is your increased stability. Since you have a image-based, a containered system, then it's not going to break as easy because you're not swapping out one unknown package. Every computer running a immutable system has the same image of that immutable system outside of any settings and tweaks you might do. They do say a few slight cons indicating the positive bias the article would have towards it. It does take more storage. Fortunately, storage is coming back. There was a short period of time when people were making the shift to SSDs. Those were much more expensive, so our storage capacities dropped significantly, and they're coming back up online now. So that's not as big of a deal. And then learning curves for some of these is learning curves. And this is one thing that for a mainstream adoption of an immutable Linux distribution, we have to greatly reduce that learning curve. Now, I think that the Ubuntu immutable desktop that they are still working on, I think it's the Ubuntu Core. Now, they already have one for servers, but they're working on one for desktop as well. That might actually be one of the best ones. I think the other one is Fedora because it's not a lot different. Silverblue is not a lot different from desktop Fedora. And Fedora is becoming a really good distribution for new users to use as well. So there are some things to say about that. But if you're doing something like NixOS is overly complicated. I considered running it as a test for a period of time, but I abandoned it just simply because I just need to do something simple with a hosts file for web development testing, and it is without rebooting the entire system or reloading a whole image. It's overly complicated to do something small and minor that I can do on any other distribution. So there is some basic thought, but we're going to get actually a little bit more into that into our next sections. First, though, we want to talk about some examples of immutable Linux distributions. So looking at a brief article from its FOSS from back in January of this year, 12 immutable Linux distributions. So if you are looking at immutable distributions and you'd like to have a look at them, these are some of the better ones. And I've looked at some of these. We do have videos. If you want to search my channel to see if I have videos for these, I'll tell you which ones I do. Carbon OS, I don't remember if I have one. So this one is an independent distribution. And here's a little side note. Actually, I completely forgot to put this in my notes, and it should have been in my notes. We'll talk about it now. What is making the immutable Linux distribution a possibility nowadays is the fact that we have better containerized packaging in the form of flat packs and snaps, and to a lesser extent app images, because these really duplicate the APK application style of an Android for a Linux distribution, allowing you to have your operating system and your applications in two separate layers, which is what Android does and what iPhone does, which Linux distributions by and large do not necessarily do. We'll get more into that a little bit later. I think I have a good place to put that down further in the notes, but let's go ahead and have a look at some examples. So here's Carbon OS is a flat pack container first approach. So that is independent and it's a GNOME desktop. Fedora Silverblue, also of course GNOME. You're going to find these are GNOME or Plasma by and large. So this one here, I believe I do have some Silverblue videos, where this is one of the first ones I remember seeing. This is the first desktop immutable Linux distribution I was aware of. I'm not sure if it was the first, but it certainly was up there, as this has been out for a number of years now. In fact, it was a number of years before I even looked at it. But this has a really good immutable system where it will remember several different versions. You can either temporarily or permanently roll back to a previous image if you would like to do that. We have Flatcar. I've never heard of this one. So community Linux-based, distribution tailored for container workloads. You get a minimal OS image, contains only the tools needed to run a container, no package manager, and no configuration hassles. So if you want to have a reliable infrastructure, this is the way to go. So probably more for a cloud instance, definitely not a desktop. NixOS is neat. I have a couple videos on Nix. It is an advanced distribution. It is a lot more complicated to run. But the cool thing about Nix is you can create a configuration file. So if you would like to, if you're running like a company and you want to have a really good immutable desktop computer, NixOS is a really good choice for that, because you can create your single configuration file, deploy that with your installation, and have your Nix system be exactly what you need your Nix system to be for every computer simultaneously. So that is one of the powers of Nix. On top of that, it does have a really good package manager, which has like every Linux software known to man. And you can actually use the Nix package manager on other systems as well. So Nix is definitely cool. It is a little bit more, the big problem I had with it is working with, again, those host files. It's just too complicated to make a simple system change for the purpose of a server development test. That's the reason I abandoned it. GUIX, never heard of this one. Similar to NixOS, tailored for advanced users wanting reliable upgrades and good control over their system. OpenSUSE Micro OS. I've not done a video on this one, but I'm familiar with it. So mostly for servers, if you want to do a containerized server with automated workflows. That's great. Vanilla OS, we have a couple videos. In fact, we just did a recent video as they have a brand new version that just rolled out not too long ago. I really like Vanilla OS. I think it has some cool components to it, but there were a few downsides I saw as well. It is based on Debian. It used to be Ubuntu, but it's now based on Debian, and it does allow you to spin up and effectively use Linux. Like the core itself is a immutable system, but then you build containers on top of that, and then you can install applications from any distribution inside of there. So Vanilla OS is definitely worth a look, particularly if you want to experiment with different Linux distributions. Bottle or Rocket, never heard of. Open source OS based on Amazon. Okay, that's probably why I ditched AWS a long time ago. Blend OS. So distribution development aims to provide all good things for all different distributions. This is also sort of like Vanilla. Vanilla and Blend are very similar in that respect. You can install RPMs, debs, etc. And then you get a nice immutable system to your core with your containers just being run on top of that core. Talius Linux, I have not seen this one before. This is designed for Kubernetes. That's probably why. And then Endless OS. I think I looked at Endless a long time ago. I actually didn't know it was immutable. Maybe it wasn't at the time I looked at it. I don't know. But this is another one based on this. And Nitrix, I believe I just downloaded an ISO for Nitrix to look at. This one's actually, you notice most of these are based on GNOME. Almost all of them. This one is actually based on Plasma. So we got one here based on Plasma, which is nice because I'm not a huge fan of GNOME. That's one of the reasons I'm not a huge fan of the immutable world. So, but there we have Nitrix. This is I think it's an independent distribution, if I remember. Oh, it's Debian-based. This is one of the Debian-based ones. That's right. So I will have a look at this one in closer detail later on. So if you are looking at one of these builds, you can go ahead and do that. But now I want to talk about a few of my individual thoughts. Let's go ahead and insert right here what I did forget to put in my notes, and that is the package management. So effectively, an immutable distribution is sort of like running an Android phone, maybe an iPhone as well, although I'm not as familiar with the technical hardware going on in there. But modern Android, it uses this immutable system. It confirms that your image is what it should be, that nobody has tampered with it, and the update just downloads a whole new image of the system, and then on boot, it just flops to the new image. So there's no updating packages in the middle of everything. It just reimages itself, and then if there's a problem with the boot, it will roll back to the previous version to see what the issue happens to be. Of course, with Android, then you install apps on top of it, which are the APK files, and the applications carry with it all of the dependencies and things that it needs to run independently of the operating system itself. So the operating system is just there for your basic system tasks, and then your applications get installed on top of it. Well, that's effectively what an immutable distribution is going to do. We have the operating system with the basic system tools independent, and what made these really proliferate in the last couple of years is now we have two big distribution systems that nearly every popular Linux application is in at least one, if not both, those being Flatpaks and Snaps. With a lot of distributions are right now preferencing Flatpaks. Canonical does have a problem with Snaps in that it has centralized its distribution. While the Snaps themselves are open source, the distribution model is centralized. And that means there's one place to go to, which means there's one place that could get corrupted or hacked or have other things, or some people just do not want a system controlled by one company, that being Canonical. So we see groups like Solus is depreciating Snaps out of their system. Not that you couldn't install it if you wanted to, but they're not supporting it. They're not installing it by default. They're not guaranteeing they're going to work. I'm seeing a lot of people moving away from those. Even Mozilla realizes that the controversy around Snaps is big enough that it has released full deb packages that any distribution that can run deb can use those individual packages so that you can have Mozilla or like Firefox or Thunderbird without relying on Snap, because Ubuntu pulled those out of their repositories to replace them with Snaps, damaging all downstream distributions from Ubuntu with its own controversy. Now, Flatpak, that model, there is one central location, but it doesn't have to be. You can define your own store. You can curate your own Flatpaks. You can create your own Flatpak stores. It is fully open sourced, even at the distribution level, which is what Snap doesn't do. But with those two domineering systems, both of those types of packages contain all of the dependencies and the things that it needs to run, allowing you to have a Linux operating system that runs effectively like an Android phone. You have an A/B for the system itself, you have the core system packages, and then you simply add the software you need to use on top of it in the form of flat packs. So that is the appeal to the system, and it gives you some good things. So we'll move on into my basic points. The first is security. This is actually good for security, but not nearly as good as most people say it is. Obviously, the advantage of using this type of system is that the core operating system is unchangeable, meaning that you as the user can't change anything. And we'll say can't change anything. There's technical ways you can in some distributions, although it's a little bit more difficult in others. But you do lose a little bit of that control. But it also means that a hacker can't get in and maliciously install a piece of software. The problem I have is most of the malware and issues we are seeing today are not actually bugs and viruses installed at that core level on your system. There are some, to be sure, but most of them are phishing sites sending you to other places, loading things inside of the computer memory, which is unimpacted by most of this, or will be scraping other files in the user directories, not in the operating system directories. So while it is good for security, it is not the security magic bullet some people suggest it might actually be. So installing software may very well be blocked. So if you are talking about some form of malware trying to install software in a traditional sense, it will fizzle. So it is secure in that respect. So this is actually good also for some people new to Linux, because it is much more difficult to break an immutable system. You know, you can give any incompetent buffoon your Android phone. They're not going to kill the Android operating system. You just can't without rooting it, of course. And that effectively is the same principle. The question I have is, do we want to have to root our Linux operating systems in order to do basic system tasks? We'll get into that in a little bit. In fact, that's our next point. We will lose control over the system. That is a downside that I see to running a immutable system. See, when I first switched to Linux, I love the fact that I had a computer that I could control. If I want to break my computer, I should be allowed to break my computer. In fact, that's kind of what happened when I had the very first real computer I got. And I had like a 386 or 486 or something running DOS and a few different things. Of course, back in that day, I didn't know anything about computers. So I'm like, man, there's a lot of stuff on this disk. Let's just start deleting stuff. Obviously, the system didn't work anymore. Whoops. All right. But I get a computer. I save up a couple $1,000 and I buy a computer with Windows 95 on it. And of course, I had extra software packages. They shipped it to me with only 256 colors, and I had graphics drivers I could install. So I installed some graphics drivers and made the colors, and I was like, whoa, it was fast. You got to understand, particularly if you're young, when we first saw computers go from like monochrome to 16 color, it was incredible. And then we see going from 16 color up to 256 color, it was incredible. When we first saw computers going from 256 colors to 16 and 32-bit true colors, it was remarkable. It was incredible. We were going to do things and look at pictures in a way we could never look at pictures before. It was fascinating in those days. But in the midst of that, I also had the ability to break my computer, which I did once. Whoops. So I talked to the guy at the computer store, and he gives me a few tips, and that's what gave me the confidence to get in there and do things. He told me a couple things to do. I redid a couple things. I fixed my computer. I'm like, wow. I had now the confidence to play around with things, knowing that if I break something, I can fix it. And this is that confidence that carries us through with computers, allowing us to survive. We want to maintain control over our own computers. Most people do not necessarily need to change file systems in our modern world. I recognize that. So an immutable system makes sense for many people. We don't have computers nowadays that require a lot of tinkering like we had back in those days. I mean, find me a computer now that's monochrome or 256 colors. We don't even think about the number of colors. They would tell us the difference between the 16 and the 32 was this one has millions and millions of colors. This one has millions and millions and millions of colors. We don't have any of those dealing with. The concept of even rolling back to 256 colors is unheard of in modern computer. So we don't have as big of a need. Most computers these days just work. So the need of actually changing a system file might actually not be necessary. And so we understand the purpose of the Immutable Linux distribution in that case. But if you do need to make a system file modification, it is difficult to impossible. Now, this is where I'd mentioned it a couple times, that host file. Let me explain what I'm talking about. When I'm doing websites in web development, you might need to be testing things on a test server and then deploying it into a live environment. So the best way to test the server completely is to redirect the local DNS on my computer using my host file to the development server. On NixOS, the process to do that, I need to change the configuration file and then reboot the entire system to get that configuration file in. There is a way, I think, to deploy it live, sort of, but it still requires a session change, which means all of the work I'm working on has to be rebooted and restarted. That is problematic if I just need to change this number, refresh the DNS cache on the browser, and then verify it's working on this server versus that server. Way too complicated to do that kind of stuff. Are there ways around that? There are ways around that. There are other means I can do on a router to change things like that, but we're still getting into more complicated than running up one line on the terminal, making one change in the code, and refreshing the browser. So if you do need to make actual system file changes, an immutable system makes it almost impossible. I look at my Arch system as well. My Endeavor computer, the recent update caused, and we're going to get into the upgrades. We'll talk a little bit more about this next. But when I went in there, I had an issue with Cody, my good buddy Cody. Well, my good buddy Cody broke on the audio, and the version that I had, they completely broke it with Pulse Audio. You had to use Pipewire. So I had to change my entire system on the core level from Pulse Audio to Pipewire. I can't do that on the immutable operating system. I had to do it on that. Now, I'm not having as good of experience on Pipewire, so hopefully with a new version I can roll that back, but we'll test that down the road a little bit later. But the problem is, if you do need to make one of those small system file changes, an immutable system makes that difficult, if not impossible. So you better hope everything does work out of the box as well as they say it should work. This leads us to the next point, is a better upgrade experience. So upgrading is generally better. Now, if you are on a metered internet connection and you don't want it to upgrade, you got to figure out a way to block it from doing that. In many of these, I'm assuming there's going to be a way that you can block it. I haven't verified that because there's all these different systems. I think Nix, you have to manually do it. Fedora tends to like doing it automatically in the background. But the upgrades are generally better because they are unified packages, or at least modules of packages. They're not doing like Arch or Debian or anything else under a basic update, overwriting the files on your existing computer. What it's doing is it is downloading the files separately, creating a separate image that's not even running, and then on the next reboot, you have to reboot your system, and then it reboots into the new image, giving you the new software. Because of this type of model, it's not going to break something, at least in the core system. And if all of your applications are running on top of snaps or flat packages, guess what? It's not breaking your software either. So you have a better, more reliable experience in your upgrading process, because everything is tested, image, and modularized. And even if you do have a problem, you can always roll back to the last known good operating system. So you basically have two versions of your system on your drive, and you just choose which one to boot. Obviously, as we said earlier, that does cause a problem if you have more, if you have a lower or smaller hard drive, that can cause some issues. However, that being said, that generally is not going to be much of the problem. Now, the system can be rolled back in whole, but not in part. Now, this is where I had a problem on my good buddy Cody, because for a while I knew this package was broken and I was able to roll it back. The problem is, eventually one of those packages, I think it was one of the Python packages, had to be upgraded for the whole system to work, and the newer version of that package would not work under the older version of Cody, forcing me to use the new version, which is effectively broken for many of the things I needed to use it for. That was part of the problem. Now, again, this would be fixed if I used the Flatpak version of Kodi. The reason I don't go to do that is because I've done a lot of system modifications to Kodi, including all the libraries. I have extensive plugins in there. I have a lot of things on my Kodi that's exactly what I wanted it to be, and I just don't want to take the time to reset all that kind of stuff under a Flatpak, and I am not a fan of Flatpaks as much as regular repository software. So that is mostly just me wanting to have more control over my system, but it did cause me to have to do things like switch over to Pipewire from Pulse Audio, use a different theme while the developer of the theme I prefer has not yet updated it, and make a few patches to the plugins that I have used. All of that is stuff I'm able to do because I do not run an immutable operating system. So this leads us to our final question. Should you use an immutable operating system? Well, it is very good in server and cloud deployments because the containerized model makes sure that you're not dealing with a headache of a server that goes crashing on down after a system update. That is the thing that terrifies me the most. I have to do server system updates. Oh, boy. You know, you can imagine the day leading up to the time that I had to not even just do an upgrade. I had to do an elevate from CentOS to Alma. 50 websites. Let's hope this works, baby. Fortunately, it did, because Alma had an amazing update script to make sure the process was flawless. But if you're doing this all on a cloud deployment system, it works a little bit better in that respect. As far as the desktop, it can be very good for a brand new Linux user because you're going to give them a system that they can't break, but you're also going to give them a system that they cannot customize and modify as easily outside the scope of what is already available inside of the system. The downside, of course, is if you look back at our list of distributions, most of these are not distributions that are easy and user-friendly. I would not give Vanilla or Blend or NixOS to a brand new person to Linux. They will be right back on Windows before the sun goes down. Okay, now the Ubuntu core, as much as I'm not a fan of snaps and not as much a fan of Ubuntu these days, I think that when that one comes out, that is going to be a very good first distribution to hand to somebody because they're going to have a solid, stable system that's not going to break with a ton of available software. So that certainly is a means. Of course, Fedora Silverblue, I would say, is probably similarly user-friendly, and we'll figure out about Nitrix OS after I actually get a chance to boot it and play around with it. And if I haven't looked at Carbon, maybe I'll go back and look at Carbon again. So it is good in that respect. Personally, immutable Linux distributions are not for me, but that is a personal choice. The reason, I want to hold control over my computer. I do not want my desktop computer to become a desktop version of Android, where I have no ability to modify the system. I'm stuck with what I have, and then I have to utilize Flatpaks for all of my software. I'm not into that in the slightest, but that is a personal preference. You should weigh out all of these different ideas about the immutable desktops, and if you do want to play around with some, right now I'd say the best, easiest, user-friendly one is going to be the Fedora Silverblue. If you're a more advanced user, you might look at Vanilla, Blend, or NixOS, and I don't know about Carbon and Nitrix, although I want to have a look at those and double check. I think I did Carbon, but I can't remember for sure. So we'll keep an eye on those down the road. Let me know your thoughts on the immutable Linux distributions in the comments down below. Again, make sure you are still subscribed to the channel if you intend to do so. Leave us a like and a comment down below. Thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux.